Hello and welcome. We are your hosts Sandesh and Anshuman. In each episode, we will pick one seemingly boring security topic and talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between. So join us for some fun, some conversations, and some super hot takes about all things security in the boring AppSec podcast. Anshuman, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's Monday, so the week has just gotten started. How are you, Sandesh?
I'm good. We usually record Friday mornings my time, so there's kind of like a weekend feel to the episodes. This one's in the beginning of the week, so we'll see how different that sounds. Cool. All right. So today we're going to talk about threat modeling. I think this is a topic which within security circles has been beaten to death. Every security expert has their own opinion. They have their own thoughts. I think that's the case for two reasons. One, because it's actually really important. It actually makes a difference. And that's kind of why, threat modeling is kind of spoken about so much. And also, it's kind of a fuzzy topic in the sense that everybody has their own definitions. Everybody has their own thing. Some people want to go all in and be really deep about it. Some people want to do it very at a high level, automate it and things like that. So I think there's a broad range of opinion, and there's no kind of definitive answer of what threat modeling is, how do you do it, how do you scale it, and so on and so forth. So I think in this episode, we'll go in a lot more into the opinion space as opposed to kind of the quote unquote fact space, right? So we'll not try and cover everything about threat modeling. I think it's too vast a topic, but let's get started with the basics, right, Anshuman? In your opinion, based on the research you've done, based on the work that you've done, what is threat modeling?
Before I answer that, I have to add a disclaimer that I'm in no way or shape a threat modeling expert. I'm just a practitioner who has tried different ways of doing threat modeling in different organizations, and I've had my own successes and failures. So like you said, we'll try to stick to opinions and experiences and not go too much into what threat modeling is and the facts and things like that. So having said that, first of all, I want to plug a website. It's called threatmodelingmanifesto.org. And if you go to that website, it sort of explains what is threat modeling, why threat model, who should threat model, so on and so forth. But really the four questions to ask when you're doing threat modeling is, what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job? And I think Adam Shostak, I have to give a shout out to Adam. I think as far as I've known, he's considered as a threat modeling guru, and I think he was the one who came up with these questions. And there are folks who have written books, like I know Izar. I've worked with Izar at some point. Matthew Coles, I've worked with Matt as well at some point. So they're all the experts. So if you're looking to understand what threat modeling is, go to those folks. Here it's all about experiences, right? So yeah, that's really, at a high level, what is threat modeling. Now, if you put a practical lens into what threat modeling really is, the simplest way to think about it is, you try to look at a system. It can be an architecture, it can be a service, it can be data flow diagram where the data is flowing from the source to the sink. It can be any number of things, right? And the primary objective is to find out threats or vulnerabilities in that particular architecture or whatever you're looking at, in the sense that you're trying to prevent these issues from happening as proactively as you can, so that you don't have to deal with them after it's already been coded and been shipped into production. So that's really my understanding of threat modeling. I'm curious to know what you think, Sandesh.
I think first of all, agree with you. Threat Modeling Manifesto is a pretty cool site. I think they get a lot of things right there, and it's a great starting point for anybody who's thinking about either doing threat modeling or learning more about it. I think I agree with the four questions that Adam's kind of posed in the past. I mean, this is something he's written about in his book as well. Very very cool way of starting to think about it, right? The way I look at threat modeling or design reviews or whatever we want to call it is pretty simple. I think a lot of security assessments focus on implementation detail, whereas threat modeling focuses on the design detail, right? And when you look at things from a design perspective, when you look at things from a slightly 10,000 foot view, you don't focus on implementation details, but you focus on the larger design issues. Now, like every assessment methodology, that means you'll not find implementation bugs in threat modeling, and that's okay, because that's not the focus of threat modeling, right? So I think in my opinion, threat modeling is looking at things from a taking a step back, looking at things from a slightly higher order perspective, and then kind of looking at identifying design flaws. And then once you get that, and I think this is the critical part, which I feel like the industry kind of misses out, is what do we do with it, right? I think even in the 4 questions you asked, right? So you spoke about like what are we working on, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good enough job? I think that actually the most important word there is we. Like who's that? Right? I sometimes feel that threat modeling experts, and guilty as charged, I've kind of been guilty of this as well. Threat modeling, I feel like, is like, buy the security, off the security, like the whole democracy thing, right? It just feels like an exercise for security people to feel, to serve the security community. Whereas every good threat modeling expert will tell you, or anybody who's done threat modeling will tell you, the real outcome of threat modeling is if you can come up with security requirements that is easy to understand and follow for developers, and they can, or architects, or who was working on the design, and they can actually solve the problem. Right? So I think identification of risk is useful, but articulation of risk, converting that into a language that the engineering teams understand, and kind of nudging them in the direction to actually solving it is critical. And I think sometimes, if I had to add one statement, I would just say that we focus far too much on the threats and the risks, etc., and not on kind of what that means from an engineering perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. I do have some follow-up questions on a few things you've mentioned. So the first is, how is threat modeling different from architecture reviews or design reviews? I ask this question because I have gone through these different activities in different organizations and gone about it in different ways. Like threat modeling, I've done it in a different way. Design reviews, I've looked at, strictly authentication, authorization, logging, so on and so forth. When you do threat modeling, you either follow a framework or you look at things like spoofing and whatnot, right? So do you mind explaining in your world, how are these two things different or similar?
I just feel one is a subset of another. I think threat modeling is a large umbrella term, which is very broad and very abstract. Exactly what you mentioned, right? Like, those 4 questions. If you look at those 4 questions, what are we working on? What can go wrong? And like, what can go wrong is as abstract as you can get. I mean, so many things can go wrong, right? So I think that's the whole point of threat modeling, is to kind of keep it broad and high level, because the idea, that idea of kind of understanding design and looking at abstract things and not real things like code or application, and still come up with security threats and then think about how to mitigate them, is threat modeling, right? It's very, very broad. Now, what does that mean exactly? So it's different if, for example, let's say you're building a bank, right? You're threat modeling a whole bank, right? That can mean a million things, right? That could mean physical security. It could mean, definitely software security or application security or infrastructure as well. It could, if you're threat modeling a bank, you have to think about fraudsters. If you're threat modeling a bank, you have to think about, folks who want to rob a bank. If you're threat modeling a bank, there's so many other things to think about, right? So threat modeling can be applied literally to anything in the world. It can be applied to countries. It can be applied to companies. It can be applied to software. It can be applied to a feature. It can be applied to humans, anything, right? So threat modeling in my head is a very broad concept. And if you kind of go back and look at history, we kind of did this at Seezo for a while. And there were references to threat modeling, I think, in the 60s and 70s as well, right? It's basically a military term, right? So to me, threat modeling is an umbrella term that everybody understands their own way, but broadly they understand it's the idea of finding threats and coming up with mitigations. Very straightforward. Now, if you talk about security design review, for example, that's a specific subset of threat modeling, right? Where you're essentially looking at the design of an application or a piece of infrastructure or whatever, and then you're trying to come up with a list of risks for it, right? A list of potential risks, and then what you can do about it. So to me, security design review only can happen when you have a design document or some kind of a design artifact. And if you don't have that, then you probably generate that through conversations, right? But threat modeling can happen once you've built an application. Threat modeling can happen when nothing is changed in your application, but something changed in the threat landscape, right? So I think threat modeling, to summarize, threat modeling is an umbrella term. Security design review is a specific subset of threat modeling, which happens when the main artifact you're reviewing is some kind of a design document. It could be a diagram, it could be a list of conversations, whatever it is. That to me is kind of the how I would define threat modeling and design review.
So just a clarifying question there. Would you say that, if an engineering team they want to build a feature in a product, right? There are multiple steps or phases to this whole process, right? Well, first is they figure out what exactly they're going to be building, right? They ideate, I think it's called the ideation phase, where they work with product managers, customers and whatnot, and they try to figure out the feature, right? And then after that, they figure out what will the design look like, right? What will the architecture, whatever they're trying to build look like, right? I think, and they go through the requirements phase and whatnot. So would you say that, we could do threat modeling at the ideation phase itself, where we just sort of ask them questions about what are they doing, again, like all the 4 questions, and then once they have a good enough understanding, and when they start thinking about the architecture is when we'll go through secure design review. Is that like a good way to think about it?
Yes and no. I mean, like I said, like threat modeling is so broad, it can happen anytime in the life cycle. It can even happen once, like just before a pen test. We used to do what we call threat modeling, right? We would think about, okay, for this application, what are the potential threats? Where should we focus on? What is the scope of what we're testing? And then once you have the threat model ready, you use the threat model to inform your pen testing plan, right? Now, this has happened after everything is built out. Right. So I think threat modeling should happen at every phase, right? Whether it's practical to do it, whether people have the skill to do it is a whole other topic.
Different
we can talk about it. But in the ideal world, in the world of unicorns and roses everywhere, threat modeling happens at every stage of the life cycle, right? Now, design reviews, you're right. So let's take a simplified version of the process you mentioned, right? Most tech companies today have the PRD and the tech spec, or instead of tech spec, they may have like an HLD, LLD. So a PRD is a product requirements document, which is essentially product teams come up with a set of requirements. They kind of defend those requirements, saying, hey, this is why the user needs it, this is what it means for revenue, yada yada yada, right? Like business language. And then that gets prioritized. Let's say for Q3 implementation, you have an engineering team kind of coming up with the technical specification for that product requirement, right? Now that could be, in some companies, it could be like just like a high level diagram and a low level diagram. It could be, in companies like Amazon, for example, where there's a big writing culture, it could be a technical specification document. Razorpay, where I used to work with before, also has a very good culture of writing. There's also technical specification writing there. There are companies which write design documents and so on and so forth, right? So there's some artifact. And then once you have that and everybody's on the same page on what we are building, so PRD is the why you're building, the tech spec is the what you're building, and then you actually do the building, which is writing code or making changes to configuration or whatever it is. So to me, design reviews happen at the stage where you have a PRD and a tech spec. Again, don't worry about these exact artifacts. The artifacts can be different. I was talking to one person who said, hey, look, nobody writes anything in our company. So all the context is in Microsoft Teams chat. And I'm like, okay, that's crazy, right? But that's where it is. If that's where it is, then that's your PRD and your tech spec, right? And maybe in such companies, conversations are more important than reviewing artifacts. So to me, security design review should happen before you start writing code. Hey, but if you don't do it before you write code, then you can do it after you write code as well. But in the roses and unicorn world, it should happen before you write code. You look at your technical specifications, your PRD, you understand why you're doing this. You kind of figure out what can go wrong. You convert that knowledge into security requirements and then give that to the developers, right? That would be how I think about security design review.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So let's dig into the outcomes a little bit more about, what are the outcomes from a threat modeling session, right? So you mentioned security requirements. I think you also mentioned our risks, right? So are the outcomes of threat modeling security requirements that, we recommend or the security engineers recommend to teams, or are the outcomes risk which the security team has identified, which will then be prioritized and figured out, right? Like how do we address those risks? Like what according to you are the outcomes?
Yeah, I think it depends on when you're doing threat modeling and which subset of threat modeling you're picking, right? So I think risk management is the goal. And if you want to manage risk, you have to identify risks, right? So you'll identify risks, and threat modeling is a way of identifying a specific type of design risk, right? So and risk management at the design phase would mean security requirements, which are sent to developers. Now, if you're threat modeling a legacy system where there's no active development, it's in maintenance phase, but it's an important product, then you really can't provide security requirements per se. There's no one to write code. So at that point, you probably are talking more about risk mitigation, right? You're probably talking about compensatory controls. You're probably saying, hey, this is this really legacy piece of software, really hard to modify. We really don't have COBOL developers to write more code for it. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this behind VPN, right? And make sure that very, very few people can access it. All of those people will have 2FA and they'll have government security clearance, right? So we all trust them, right? whatever. I mean, I'm just making up controls here, but that has nothing to do with code or giving requirements. It's more compensatory control, which happens more at the infra governance paperwork layer, right? So I think the idea is identify risk, come up with ways to mitigate risk, and the actual mitigation is done by somebody else, right? How that translates into a security design review is to identify security requirements and then provide ways of how you can meet those requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, I feel like we have sort of discussed what threat modeling is, what are the outcomes, what are the requirements in detail. So coming back to your original question of what do we do with it, like, or who is we in this? So curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, look, I have a big bias here, and I'm kind of using the anchoring effect to make a bold statement, which may not be, which even I may not believe in all the time, but I think that's the direction we should go to, right? I think threat modeling and security design reviews are all about developers. Like, that's it. It starts with it's like the Steve Ballmer thing, right? On stage event, shouting developers. That's what it is, right? I think that's all. The focus of these activities should be enabling developers, to write better, more secure code, and to make sure that the design level security flaws are handled even before they're found. That is the ultimate goal, right? And the reason it's important, in my opinion, is because in static analysis, SCA, container scanning, DAST, for example, it's very hard to understand application context, especially in today's SDLC, where changes are basically like 10 lines of code. It's a PR, which is 10 lines of code, and you're only scanning those 10 lines of code, right? At that contextual level, it's very hard to understand business logic. So the only two places where you can understand business logic is one at the design review level, where you're looking at the product requirements, why you're doing it and how we're doing it, and then at pen testing. In my opinion, if you can do unlimited pen testing with the best pen testing resources in the world, threat modeling is not that critical. It's still critical for certain things because of attack surface and all that, because there may be some attack surface that you're not testing in pen testing, but it may be possible for internal employees to access and all that. But in general, right, pen testing is a great way of also finding out business logic issues. The only problem is it's all the way to the right of the life cycle, and it's super expensive to get qualified manual pen testers to it. And I know we spoke about the bug bounty program, so folks can look at that episode. But in general, it's just too late in the life cycle, and if you can find it earlier, the better, right? So that's kind of why I believe that the goal of threat modeling should be to kind of make it provide useful information for developers to mitigate serious security flaws. That should be the goal, and developers are the we, right? We're all the security engineers like you and me are supporting cast, right? The main cast are the developers. So
a quick question on that: in your experiences, having worked at companies, how often have you seen that this statement holds true, which is the developers are actually doing threat modeling and design reviews? I ask this because I have not seen that anywhere. Smaller companies, big companies. So I'm really curious to know why, or like, what has your experience been? Yeah.
Developers don't. Look, I think intuitively, really good engineers do threat modeling. They may not call it that. Like a couple of engineers I've worked with, when I was at Razorpay, they were kind of the early engineers at Razorpay. They intuitively understood threat modeling. They never called it that, but every time they built something, they wondered how could this be exploited, how could this be abused, and then kind of built it in a resilient manner, right? They didn't have the language to call it design review, threat modeling, etc., but they did it, right? But at scale, to have developers do threat modeling is a crazy expectation, right? I think what I meant was that the outcome of threat modeling should be tailored to developers. It doesn't matter who does it. It can be a tool. I'm a believer in automation. I believe that modeling can be automated. I know that we'll get to that debate, right? But my sense is that it doesn't matter who does the threat modeling. It matters within your company, but it doesn't matter at a broad level who does threat modeling. But what matters is that who's going to consume the output. And when you have an output which is a complicated diagram with like a bunch of assets, controls, threat actors, and stuff like that, this is not language that developers understand. Right? Maybe some developers understand, right? You and I understand. We like words like traceability matrix and threat actors and all that. But this is not the language they understand. The language they understand is, what is the requirement? Why do we have to do what we have to do? What is the priority? What happens if I don't do it? Right? That simply is description, impact, and priority, right? In the security language, right? So I think the problem I have is this whole focus on diagramming and the focus on kind of diagramming as an output, as 80% of the time spent on threat modeling becomes writing diagrams and showing diagrams. An amazing lesson I learned is, I used to be in consulting for a long time, as I've mentioned many times on the show now, and we used to focus on writing really good diagrams, right? And what we noticed is that our customers were usually in the security team, right? And they were very excited by our diagrams. And I used to get very excited when my customers get excited, right? So I used to focus a lot on drawing diagrams rather. When I kind of became part of a product security team, we also spent a lot of time drawing diagrams, and developers were also very impressed by it, but they had no idea what to do with it, right?
Yeah.
It didn't really make that much sense. Maybe there was an architect somewhere who kind of appreciated the effort that went into it and appreciated how, beautifully we kind of condensed a lot of information into a single diagram. That was skill. It's not easy to do. It's appreciable that somebody can do it. But it's really not that helpful, right? What's really helpful is if you can articulate it in a language that developers really understand. So if I had to put it in ChatGPT terms, is that, when you give a system prompt, you don't start with you're a cybersecurity expert, you start with you're a developer. And then you kind of like write your entire report based on that. So that way we make it easier, like less jargon, less security jargon, more software engineering terms and more SDLC terms. And that's probably what kind of helps, developers consume threat modeling outcomes better.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you've said, and the reason why is because in my experiences, I've tried to do threat modeling in different ways. So like you said, I've tried to follow the STRIDE methodology, and for those who don't know, STRIDE is basically a framework where you consider different kinds of attack vectors and you see if those attack vectors could be exploited or not. So S for spoofing, T for tampering, so on and so forth. You can find out about that, and we'll provide the link in show notes, right? So in my experience, what I've seen is if I end up scheduling a session with an engineering team where I ask them to bring an architecture diagram to the meeting, and then we just kind of sit and walk through the STRIDE framework, the feeling that I get out of the meeting after the meeting is ended is sort of very weird, and I don't like fuzzy, because on one hand I know I was able to get to the outcome that I actually set forth, is to figure out the risk and whatnot. On the other hand, I'm not exactly sure if the engineering team actually understood or sort of found value in it. It was more like a chore for them. So I think what it boils down to is instilling a culture in the organization of thinking about whatever you do in a way that you have the security hat on as well, right? Because in other words, you don't have to follow a framework of doing threat modeling. You can just ask these 4 questions in whatever you're doing, right? And if you do that for every feature, for every product you build, that kind of gets baked in the culture itself, right? And once that happens, I don't think any security team needs to do a formal threat model for every feature, for every product, right? Because like you said, right, if engineers are trained, or if they just kind of do that innately, I think that's more than enough, right? So yeah, man, I think that's a very important point that you mentioned.
Yeah, you brought up the most important point, right? So the whole culture aspect of it, you're right. If developers innately, like the 2 amazing developers I spoke about, if every developer was that way, it's kind of like the whole John Lennon imagined world, right? I mean, if it was that way, then life would be great and we wouldn't have to worry too much about tooling. But the reality is, the reason we set up processes, the reason we have automation, the reason we have checklists is not for those 2 rockstar engineers who can kind of do this. It's for everybody else, like mere mortals like us, right? Who kind of have to, how do we instill this culture actually in the real world, right? It's actually quite hard, right? And I think that's kind of where I'm not very bullish about kind of like things like Security Champions program, which by the way I've spent a lot of time building, and I'm really this is one of the best experiences for me as a product security leader to build a Security Champions program, to see it in action, etc. But Security Champions program don't work unless you have 1 or 2 people who are extremely passionate about it. And again, it's the great man theory thing, right? There's any process, anything which is dependent on 1 or 2 people to carry it out. So I think that's the point, right? So if you have one person on your team who is a fantastic threat modeler, I don't know if that's a word, but if it's fantastic at doing threat models, it is okay. So if that person's an amazing threat modeler and that person quits, what happens then? Right? Like, how do you scale this? Right? We spoke in a previous episode about having like a skewed ratio between security engineers and engineers. So what happens if your other security engineers are not as passionate, right? So my sense is that, threat modeling is too important to kind of leave it to the great man, right? And kind of rely on 1 or 2 people, right? It has to, if you're a product security leader, you have to find a way of automating it to an extent where at least, even if you don't automate it using tooling, etc., you have to find a way where this happens more regularly, right? And it's okay if it's not perfect. It's okay if it's not the best threat modeling thing in the world, right? So you have to kind of take all the definitions in the world, the strides, the pastas, the 4 question, the everything, every framework you have. You should absolutely read all of them. They're a wealth of information. Figure out which of that is useful for your company, which makes sense for your company and which is implementable in your current environment. Define that. and find tools / processes / checklists to help you execute. If that's kind of how I would do it, and we'll talk a little bit about tooling as well in the next few minutes. But I think that is an approach I think that can work and can scale.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a few things there, and I want to unpack each one of them one after the other. So the first thing you mentioned was we are going to speak about different tools, right? So I think I'll save that for later. But I think you mentioned automation, right? Automating threat modeling, I think I don't believe in it, to be completely honest. And obviously because, going back to your previous point of, you can't have just one or two rockstar engineers doing threat modeling, right? You have to do it consistently in a way that produces those, if not the same, similar outcomes of what is expected. And then you also doing threat modeling in a way that is sort of consistent across different folks across different teams, right? So, and I think part of threat modeling or doing threat modeling, there is that manual element involved. Like you can't just threat model a piece of architecture in a way that is completely automated, that does not involve any human, right? I don't believe in that. Maybe with AI and whatnot, this changes, which I'm sure it will, right? But I think automating threat modeling end to end is something I haven't seen yet. So I'm curious to know if you have seen and if yes, what are your experiences around that?
So let's break it down, right? So first of all, when we can't even, like, two security people who've spent over a decade in security sit together and try to define threat model when we can't get to a single easy to define thing. Okay, so if you can't do that, then obviously we can't automate threat modeling. Like you can't, by definition, if you can't define something, you can't automate it, right? Because like computers need to understand what you want to automate, right? So I'm with you that end-to-end automation is not possible, but that's also a very zero or one thinking, right? I don't think it's that binary, right? You don't have to automate all of it to make it scalable, right? I mean, the question is, can we automate it enough to make it easy to do it consistently, right? Can we reduce the bar on can we reduce the amount of manual effort needed to do threat modeling, which makes it easier to do it over and over and over again? Like that's the question really, right? And also again, I don't think you can, again, when you say automate threat modeling, we don't know which part of threat modeling we're talking about. Like I said, threat modeling is a concept, right? But assessment or an activity, which is a subset of a threat model, can be a security design review. It can be like every time something, every week you get a snapshot of how your cloud architecture changed, and then you identify if something changed there from a design perspective, which can lead to a vulnerability. That is also threat modeling, but that's not the same as the security design review that I spoke about, right? So I think if we can narrow down the definition of the most common work you do within threat modeling. So if you say these are the 4 things we'll do in my company, right? So we'll look at PRD, we'll look at every new tech spec, we'll identify if there's a security significant feature, and then we will look for possible issues with that security implementation, and then we'll come up with requirements. If you're saying these are the 4 steps in your threat modeling world for your company, then you can then break down and say, hey, which of these 4 steps can I automate? Can I automate the discovery of new features being built? Can I automate the discovery of whether a given feature has a security impact or not, irrespective of how well it's designed? Is it touching authentication? Is it touching authorization? Is it just a CSS change for a background color, which makes no difference, right? So maybe you can automate that. Then you can think about saying, okay, so now that I've identified if a new feature is security significant, can I identify the potential security requirements from my security requirements, from my coding standards policy? Can I kind of narrow down on the 10 requirements that are important for this particular new design or new specification? Can I automate that? And the 4th thing will be, hey, can I automate like the report writing and the communication to the developers, right? So when you break it down like that, the answer may be yes to some steps and no to some other steps, and then you can automate those portions of it, right? So I don't think the goal should ever be to, I think we kind of lose focus when we say things like automate threat modeling, because it's such a large, there's a phrase in India we use things, it's usually called the Mahatma Gandhi problem, like problems which only Gandhi can solve, right? So you should not go after them because we're not Gandhi, right? So we are mere mortals, right? So automating threat modeling to me is a Gandhi level problem. You can't solve it. But forget it. There's no point thinking about it that way. But can we break it down and solve the smaller problems, automate the smaller problems, so that we can help scale whatever our definition of threat modeling is for our company? That's how I would go about it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think what I really sort of, to like sum it up, I think what you're saying is threat modeling can mean different things to different folks in different companies. What works for company A might not work for company B. So it's important to first identify what threat modeling is and what exactly are you trying to do with it. And then sort of see if you can break the process or the activity into multiple phases and see how much of it can be automated, and if so, why not go do it? Yeah, I think that makes sense. That is essentially breaking a big problem, like you said, Mahatma Gandhi problem, to smaller pieces and then going after them one after the other. Got it. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, with the automation piece?
No. I think it's a good time probably just to go into the tools, because we spoke about automation as well, right? So I think I would break down tools into multiple kinds of things, right? I think ever since I've started working in security, people have talked about how we can automate threat modeling. So there are some tools which are more focused on helping you do the drawing piece, right? Because again, we can talk about if drawing is mandatory or not. In my opinion, it's not mandatory, but it's a really fun exercise. So I do it because I love it. Not necessarily because it's mandatory, but let's say your definition of threat modeling that you've defined for your company requires you to draw a diagram, right? And I think there are tools which help you kind of do that. I think Microsoft has a threat modeler tool which kind of helps you draw diagrams pretty well. Erase Risk is another tool which kind of really helps with visualization. Does a pretty good job. OWASP Threat Dragon also, I think, does that. I haven't played around much with it, but the time I did, I kind of found them pretty cumbersome. But it may work for you, right? And to be honest, what they do pretty well is that if you're drawing in a tool like Visio, it's so hard to do it that these things just make it a little easier to do that, right? I am myself more a Excalidraw type person.
Oh man, I love Excalidraw.
Yeah, it's like it's very rough, it's very straightforward. It's the closest you can get to like pen and paper, as opposed to like I think in threat modeling automation, like in most things in the world, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? So if you want to draw the perfect diagram, it's really hard, really time consuming, really hard to scale. But if you want to draw something which kind of gets you 80% of the way, I think Excalidraw can do a pretty decent job, especially if you kind of do a little bit of preparation and a little bit of writing on how to draw diagrams and what kind of diagrams work. Then I think you can just use basic tools to kind of draw diagrams well. So I think there's a bunch of tools on the diagramming side. And when I say diagramming, I want to be clear that they don't just do diagrams. They kind of help you kind of make your choice easy, right? So, okay, let me take a step back. I think when you're doing threat modeling, one is the technique and the process. The other thing is kind of the knowledge base, right? So what are the 100 different kinds of things that can go wrong? That's something which is very hard to have consistency across your security team. So if you have 5 security architects, not all 5 of them may agree upon what the 100 things are, right? So these tools do a good job at kind of telling you what those 100 things are. So you have like a base. So you have consistently like a checklist that everybody is going after. You could replace this with an Excel sheet as well. That's fine. But these tools kind of make it easy to adopt, right? So I think Erase Risk, OWASP Threat Dragon, pretty good. There's another tool called SD Elements. By the way, OWASP Threat Dragon is free. I believe Microsoft Threat Model is also free and open source now. I don't know if it's open source, but I think it's free to use. And Erase Risk is a commercial tool. There's another tool called SD Elements, I think by a company called Security Innovation. They can do a pretty good job of helping you generate security requirements. There's a lot of form filling there. You have to answer a bunch of questions, and based on that, you get a list of security requirements, right? So that's another tool which has been around for a long time, and many companies use that as well. So this is kind of the on the automation part. On the legacy part, not when I say legacy, I mean things which are there for a long time. If you have access to good consulting companies, like if you work with a boutique consulting company which does threat modeling, or even some of the big firms, they have some fantastic checklists and processes to do these reviews, right? So you could definitely partner with them and come up with something very low tech, just like like spreadsheets, some Jira automation, and like a process involving like Google Calendar and drawings, right? Just that itself can actually add like value. So if you have like an Excalidraw stencil which helps you draw faster, if you have a checklist which goes through every kind of the things that you care more about from a security controls or risk perspective, and kind of a process which has like hey, before you start a sprint in Jira, you have to make sure you finish your threat modeling. So that's a step that manually a developer has to complete in accordance with their security champion. I'm making these things up, but I'm just trying to say that you don't need like a high-tech commercial solution. Even low-tech solutions involving process improvements can kind of help you there. So that's the second kind of tooling, right? So process improvements, using your existing dev tooling to kind of make threat modeling easier. Second is commercial tools, which help you with the traditional way of doing threat modeling. The third way, which obviously I'm most excited about because I'm kind of building a company in the same area as well, is in the realm of using GenAI to kind of solve some of this, right? So to take a step back on why GenAI is exciting for threat modeling or design reviews is that, when if you look at application security automation, right, they kind of fall into 2 different categories in my head, right? So one is some kind of static analysis. It could be on code, it could be on container images, it could be on libraries, whatever it is, where you have structured input. Like any kind of code is structured input, right? It follows a particular kind of particular syntax. You can convert them into abstract syntax trees or OCaml or whatever. There's a structure to it, and you ask questions of that structured data to get you structured responses in terms of findings. So static analysis does really well with code, okay, of all kinds. And then dynamic analysis or DAST, right, or any kind of pen testing tools look at traffic, right? So from Wireshark to Burp Suite, they all look at traffic, right? So for example, Burp Suite looks at HTTP, which has a particular structure. It has headers, it has the URL, blah, 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 and it has the content and the body and everything, right? So you're able to navigate that structure and get some intelligence out of it. Some of it may be security requirements. The problem with threat modeling and design reviews in general, design reviews and threat modeling in general, is that your input is non-standard. It's usually in English, but depending on what part of the world you're in, it may not even be in English. Diagrams are common in design documents, but not standardized. So you don't know how to read them. And I feel like we never had the technology to actually extract context from text and diagrams. Right? That was very hard. Now, some machine learning engineer might tell you that, hey, NLP could do this 5 years ago, but it was not an API call away, right? You had to like really be an ML engineer to kind of, like an ML scientist or whatever, to kind of be able to extract that. With Gen AI, what you really have is that you have an API where you can extract context from English, essentially, right? And then make sense of it, right? So if you combine that with the cybersecurity knowledge that we all possess, I believe we can take a big whack at doing threat modeling in an automated fashion, right? It's very early days. Obviously, I'm bullish about it, but if I was a owner of security, I would still I would tread carefully. I would try it, but not buy it immediately. But I think it's early days, but I'm seeing a lot of promise, right? And I'm not the only one thinking about it this way. I've spoken to at least 3 different companies, who are building this in-house for their personal use case. One company which has spoken about it publicly, I believe, is Databricks. There was a fantastic talk in Black Hat by MJ Mrutyunjay last year. I will link it in the show notes. Which talks about how they're using NLP to kind of internally generate security requirements of design documents. There are a few other companies who I have spoken to who do the same thing as well. There are tools like stridegpt, threat modeling GPT, which are GPT plus plugins, where you can go in and generate a quick stride diagram using Mermaid.js, etc. Which is again very quick and dirty, but just saves so much grunt work, right? And if you can incorporate this into your lifecycle, then it can help as well. Then there are a few companies like Nullify, based out of Australia, I think, if I remember correctly, and also Remisec, or based out of the Bay Area, who are kind of trying to use Gen AI to solve a lot of these problems. They may not be limited to design reviews. I think they're doing a lot of other things as well, which is very cool. And then of course there's my company Seezo, which is where we are also trying to do this, right? So I think it's super exciting timing for tooling on design reviews and threat modeling. I know a lot of the security purists may not like this thing that it's possible to automate threat modeling, but I think it's worth taking a crack at, like a serious crack at, and trying to solve this problem using Gen AI. Okay, let me stop there and see if you have anything to
that is quite a lot to unpack. So, well, first of all, I'll just start with, I haven't used any tools for threat modeling so far in my career. You mentioned Red Dragon, SG Elements, Arius Risk, Microsoft's. I have not used any of them. And the reason why is because when I wanted to do threat modeling at a place, right, I didn't want to spend a week, maybe 2 weeks in just trying to understand what the tool is, how to use it, how to configure it, all of that stuff, right? So I will link this presentation in the show notes, but there's this guy, Jonathan Marcel, I believe his name is. He gave a presentation about how to go about threat modeling using paper and pen. And, so like you said, I've used Excalibur as well. And I think that just works perfectly. So for folks who might be feeling overwhelmed, right, by listening to all of these tools and whatnot, I think you don't have to use any of these tools. You can just use Excalibur or paper and pen and go about it, right? Now, coming back to your Gen AI usage of threat modeling.
Can I ask you a question before we go into Gen AI? Yeah. I understand where you're coming from on the using the pen and paper approach, right? And I kind of like that approach as well. And that's kind of what I have done for most of my career, though recently that's changed. The question really is, how do you scale that? Like, how do you improve coverage? I mean, is there, like, I think Jeevan, I forget the last name, Jeevan Saini, I think. Sorry if I got the name wrong. We'll again link it in the show notes. He has a fantastic GitHub repo on kind of, using security champions and how to train developers in doing threat modeling. I absolutely love it. He spoke a little bit about RRAs as well, which I know you've written about, Mozilla's rapid risk assessment framework, right? It's brilliant, right? I think I think those processes, those way of teaching people how to do threat modeling is very, very helpful. The only problem is it's not a either or. It's not that you have to have either tools or processes. My sense is that it's a great way to get started, but how do you scale? So before we get into the Gen AI discussion, and obviously I want to talk about that, right? Yeah. But I think the question I have for you is, do you think we can get far enough with just processes and training? Is that possible? Because if it's possible, then maybe not every company needs a tool, and that's okay.
No, I think that's a good question, and I think it all boils down to the skills of your product security, application security team, right? And by that, what I mean is, if you have reasonably skilled AppSec folks on your team who can sort of agree on, just kind of the framework of how to do threat modeling using a pen or paper or whatever tool you decide. Obviously, its consistency is going to take a hit, like you mentioned, right? If we don't have it automated, if you don't have the entire security requirements and all of that figured out, consistency will definitely take a hit for sure, right? But if you do have like a team and you've spoken about how you're going to go about it, what are the kinds of things you will be looking for, right? At least in my experience, I've seen the outcome is more or less similar. Like there'll be some confusion, or the outcomes will not be the exact, but I think 80% of the major threats that you could identify in a threat modeling session do get identified by this kind of approach, right? So I agree with you. It's not consistent, it's not scalable, but I think for folks who have to do threat modeling, or who just want to identify threats right as soon as possible, and they don't want to go through the process of learning about different tools, frameworks, whatnot, I think just starting somewhere is better than not doing anything at all. That's my take on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I think if I can summarize what you said, is that if you essentially have like a bit of a rockstar AppSec team where you have enough people and you're able to kind of get it all the way, we should go ahead and do it. It kind of works anyway. We don't really need to kind of rely on tooling. But if you don't have that, then maybe you want to think of, and if you're a product security leader and you cannot build such a team very quickly, or at least until you build that team, maybe you should think about kind of like tooling and things like that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
There's one other aspect to this conversation is threat modeling as code. I don't know how much of this have you seen in your experience, but I've actually tried to implement this in one place and I failed miserably, right? Because when you think about threat modeling as code, what essentially you're trying to do or say is you're going to ask engineers to write scenarios of exploitation while they're writing code, right? And at least from what my understanding of threat modeling as code, that seems to be the framework of how you go about it, right? Like in every feature or in every product release, come up with attack scenarios and then you write it in the code, and then that will generate a threat modeling diagram for you with all the risk enumerated and whatnot. I have not seen that work because again, scaling and having or expecting engineers to do that while they're also writing code is just too much. Curious to see what your experiences are.
No, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record now because I now say this in every episode. Among the hardest things to do if you're a security leader is to change developer behavior, right? You can do a lot, but changing the behavior is very, very hard. So pick your battles, right? I mean, obviously developer change is needed. Like otherwise, how will we deal with all the security problems this industry has, right? So I'm not saying we should not attempt changing developer behavior, but please pick your battles. Like, you should really affect change in behavior where things are absolutely needed, and where they are not absolutely needed, it's better off for security to change its behavior to align with the SDLC. Right, to get to the same outcome, of course. So my sense is that you can definitely do this whole, come up with the, ask the developers to kind of do threat modeling as code and all that, if that's the battle you want to pick, right? But again, when you're 1:100, if this is like a David Goliath fight, we are always David, right? So the way I think about it is that, it's just a matter of, again, prioritization, picking the right battles and all that. If you believe you can change your developer behavior in your company, right, you should go about doing it. Like if you're a 10 people company where there are 4 engineers and you're building some in a space where security is important and the whole company agrees that security is critical, then maybe from day one you can initiate this. And when you do that, even when the company becomes 100 people, maybe you can scale it. Right? Again, is it possible? I mean, the odds may be low, but it's not, the probability is not zero, right? But like I said, at least in me, wherever developer changing developers' behavior comes into the picture, I just like slightly leave the room because I'm like, it's very hard to do. And I'd rather focus on areas where I can modify my behavior to match theirs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think culture is what it is, right? Like if you don't have the culture and if you're trying to change the culture, it's a huge undertaking, right? Okay, before again we move on to Gen AI discussion, there's one more thing which I've been wanting to just kind of get others' opinions, and I would love to see what you feel is doing threat modeling on an ad hoc basis versus on a continuous basis. This is something I've struggled with a lot, right? Like with every feature release, if you if you're doing threat modeling for a feature release, whatever, you should be doing it for every major feature release, right? But oftentimes what I've seen, and this is from a real world examples, is code changes a lot, architecture changes a lot, and these changes might be happening without you even knowing about them, or without the engineering team, alerting you about it, right? So if you're doing threat modeling, just doing it before, like a major feature release is fine. But then if you don't do it continuously on every major feature release, what is the point of it? I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I mean, I think there's a theoretical answer, which is that every new feature has to go through a threat model. It kind of, I mean, it's a great answer, but the next question is how, right? Is the real big question, right? If you have to do in every new feature, I think the consensus in the industry today is that you don't need it on every new feature, because every new feature, unlike say 15 years ago in the waterfall world, where every feature release was every 6 months, right? So every big release had some security implications, right? That's not the case today. People push code every day. People push code multiple times every day. So when that happens, I think it's really hard. Okay, let me take a step back. When you're releasing multiple times a day, the odds that every feature is security significant or requires a design review is probably not true, right? So one way of looking at it is that, hey, you train your developers for them to determine which ones are security significant, and then they bring in the security team or the security processes, or they activate the whole threat modeling process when they believe it's a security significant change. I think that works well as long as you can change developer behavior. Again, I keep coming back to the same thing, to identify a security significant change, right? So, but this may be a battle worth picking though, right? Because this is something which is fundamental. You get them to think about security significance and all that. But I think that's kind of where it is, right? So I don't think you need to threat model every feature, but I think it's critical to, I think at least the quote unquote algorithm of identifying if a feature may have security implications has to happen on every feature. Like that identification algorithm, whatever it is, it can be a human looking at it, it can be a tool, whatever it is, that has to happen in every feature, every change. And then whether to actually dig deep and do your threat modeling process, that can be a design review process, that can be a stride methodology, whatever it is, that can happen on a subset of things. And even within that, some of them may be so significant that you might say, hey, not only will we do a threat model, but we'll also kind of make sure that before this is deployed finally, all the way at the right, we'll do another round of manual pen testing, another round of threat modeling, and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of the way I look at it. In the ideal world, I think every feature should go through a evaluation of if threat modeling is needed. If the answer is yes, then you go through the threat modeling process right there. And for a smaller subset of that, maybe you need like the equivalent of integration testing, right? In threat modeling, where you think about, hey, what does this mean for the larger system, right? And you can do that at the end of the life cycle as well. It's fine, but they have to be for a very, very small percentage of feature changes. Otherwise, you'll never be able to scale.
Yeah, no, I think that's why security is hard, and that's why if you don't think about security from like the fundamental problems, right, like the culture and whatnot and developer behavior, I think it's an uphill battle, right, whichever path you choose. Okay, all right. So I think those are all the questions I had before we jump into the Gen AI space. So I'm good. Did you have anything else?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so Gen AI and automating things like threat modeling and security activities or design reviews, whatever, right? So disclaimer, so at Lyft, where I'm currently working, we've also been sort of exploring, how can we leverage Gen AI to help scale ourselves with some of these activities, just because it takes too much manual effort, and we're trying to stay lean and whatnot, right? And I think based on what we have so far and based on what I've seen, building POCs and whatnot, it is possible to a certain extent, right? There has to be a human in the loop, obviously. But I think for most of the grunt work, right, like to give you an example, if an engineering team is implementing an OAuth flow, particular product, now there's some very common gotchas in OAuth or like security vulnerabilities that you should be aware of, right? And these are pretty well known. Like if you go through the RFC, you can read about those things because there's security considerations in the RFC of OAuth as well, right? So if you provide these kind of documentation, whether it is internally or externally, to your LLM, whatever you're building, right? And then if you identify from like a PRD or a spec diagram that they are doing something with OAuth, right? I think in these kind of cases where we know we have provided the security best practices and things to look out for to the LLM system that you're building, and then you've also provided things or the PRD for what is being proposed to build, right? I think in these cases, yes, there's no reason why you should not be using LLMs or AI, right? Because it's as simple as you understand what is being built and you know what are the security best practices, and you just try to see if they're falling. However, I think the real tricky thing and the gotcha is, if the teams might be doing something else, something different, or if they might be using tool or a technology that is not known in that OAuth RFC, right? I think this is where having a human in the loop really helps, because they can basically augment the documentation by the extra context that, look, Lyft is building this kind of thing, and by the way, there are also these kind of tools and technologies that we have built that we are going to use. So can you combine all of this, right? I have not seen the other case that I just spoke about being solved, but at least for the first case, right, where you're just kind of looking at thing based on what you already know, I think LLM is perfect for those use cases.
Yeah. So 3 quick points, right? So fascinating what you said. So one, I think it's a little bit more like a American football analogy, is that the goal is not to kind of score a touchdown. The goal is to move the ball 10 yards, right? So that's what we're trying to do, right? The goal, I mean, I don't think end goal is even visible right now, right? We know what it is, but we can't, it's so far that, the whole, if automating threat modeling is the end goal, then we're not there yet. Let's be very clear, right? But I think we can move the ball forward, right? And I think we can take it to the next, first down. So I think the way I look at it is that, so that's one, right? So the goal is improvement, not ultimate perfection. The second point is, I think, if I can summarize what you said or put it a little differently, I think GenAI is a great way to deliver security requirements in a meaningful way. Okay, so let me tell you what I mean by that. Most companies have some kind of security standards, right, which has a list of 100 things developers have to do from a security perspective, right? But that's very hard to consume for developers. That's very hard to remember for developers. The way we do that is by either publishing a document, conducting annual training sessions or quarterly training sessions, and so on and so forth. None of these stick, right? They're all useful, but they don't stick, right? And they're not contextual. What you can do now is, looking at your PRD and your tech spec, or your, HLD, LLD, whatever it is, you can say, hey, there are 150 requirements, security requirements we have, but for the feature you're building, these are the 4 that really matter, right? So if you're not building a new OAuth flow in your design, in your PRD on your new feature, then you don't have to talk about the OAuth security requirements at all, right? Maybe what you're really doing is handling PII, and then you got to have the requirements which talk about how to not log PII, how to mask PII before logging, what encryption standards you have to use before you encrypt them, and what library you have to call to make sure you do secure, to encrypt properly. That's the only 3 requirements which are required for this feature. Now you can use GenAI to deliver the precise requirements needed for the developers, and that makes it so much easier for developers to consume security requirements, which traditionally have been very, very hard to consume, right? And I think that's the second point I want to make, right? So one is moving the ball forward, second is delivering security requirements, and the third point is, I agree with you. I think we're still not there where a human in the loop cannot be in the place. So I'll tell you a little bit about my company for a second there. So we were thinking of building a threat modeling software, right? And that's what we're doing right now as well. You can use the software to kind of do security design reviews and so on and so forth. But we kept running into this issue where it adds value, but not enough to become completely automated. Like, you still have to have some human in the loop, like we say. And then I read this fantastic post by a investor named Sarah Tavel. We'll link it in the show notes, which spoke about, again, this is going into the business side, so apologies if you're not interested in this, but it goes into the fact that using AI, what you can really do is you can sell work, not software, right? So in the last 20 years, every time you build something, the goal was, I'll sell you a software which makes your life simpler, whatever, right? So that's the whole software licensing revolution, and then the SaaS revolution as well, right? Software as a service. But I think what we really need is either work as a service or outcome as a service, where most of the work may be done by software, including GenAI APIs, but some of the work still needs to be done by humans. Now that can be, an internal security engineer at your company, or it could be like a consulting company which looks at these results and is able to do the design review at much faster time because it's now powered by GenAI, or it could be somebody else, right? But I agree with you that in the current maturity of large language models, where GPT-4 is and Claude 3 opposites, a human in the loop is still necessary, right? And we shouldn't, and that's okay. It doesn't mean it's not valuable. It doesn't mean it's not a product anymore, right? You can still get massive productivity gains, but if you remove the, if you remove the human in the loop, you're not solving one of the biggest challenges with GenAI, which is how do you take a tool which is inherently non-deterministic and provide deterministic outputs, right? That's the hard part about GenAI. And the one way to solve that problem is by putting a skilled human in the loop. So, those are the 3 points I want to make with, for what you said. I agree with most of what you say, but I think if you look at it from these 3 perspectives, we can probably make a lot more progress.
Quick question on your second point. So what I understand is, if you as a company, if you can come up with security requirements, right? And if you provide these set of security requirements to your LLM system, I think it is possible for the LLM to be smart enough to read the context of what is being provided, right? And then compare or sort of make sense of that context against the security requirements. So I think in my example of the OAuth flow, right? Like if we did give a bunch of security requirements to the LLM system, it would be smart enough to know that the feature being proposed has only to do with OAuth. Like there's no other aspect to it. So the recommendation that it might give or the scrutinization that it will do is only going to be restricted to the OAuth scope, right? Is my understanding accurate there?
Yeah, it's accurate, but let me take a step back and tell you kind of how I think about it, right? I think LLMs hallucinate a lot when you ask them open-ended questions, but they're pretty good when you ask them specific questions, right? So you're better off asking yes or no questions than, hey, we're using OAuth, what are the best security requirements? So that is a question where you can get a lot of hallucination and a lot of false positives, right? On the other hand, if you say, hey, are we using OAuth in this application? The answer will be pretty accurate. It'll be yes or no. Okay, so now it says yes. So now we can ask, okay, is implicit flow being used, right? And then it says again, yes or no. Okay, so now you're using implicit flow, which is not the best way of doing it. So now we come up with security requirements, which says, hey, if you're using implicit flow, well, consider not using it. But if you are, then here's how you kind of make it secure, right? And that can come from your security requirements, right? So think of it like a decision tree as opposed to kind of, so decision trees plus RAG is how kind of we are looking at making, a non-deterministic tool like LLMs more deterministic. Right. Yeah. So the part that nobody else can do, when I say nobody else, I mean non-GenAI tools cannot do, is extract this context from a document, right? Give like a good yes or no answer. That is something that non-GenAI tools cannot do. But once you do that, you still should rely on as many deterministic things as possible, right? So the way we think about it is that prompts in the end are like your custom rules or like your rule set from, let's say, SameGraph, right? So you still need to kind of ask it specific questions instead of asking generic broad questions. So you still need to think like a security tool person, where you have to write like a bunch of rules. You don't have a choice. You can't get away from it. I was hoping to get away from it, but I don't think we can, right? Not without really compromising on accuracy.
So I have to ask you this hard question. Aren't you scared or worried that you're giving away your secret sauce of using decision trees and, asking it the right questions and going through the loop? I mean, that seems to be like the trick here, right?
Look, there are two things, right? So how do I put this? This podcast is going in directions that I didn't expect, but I know the answer to this question. I'll tell you where I am. I'm as excited about somebody solving this problem as I am about my company solving it, right? So if somebody listens to this and does a better job, then I'm kind of excited about that too. I don't know if that's, look, I don't think ideas are that important for a company. I think execution is. Right? I think we're better off sharing our ideas with everyone, and then somebody will work with us on better execution. If when you build a tech company, the one thing I've learned being at Razorpay, which is like a fantastic company, is that you really need amazing employees to kind of build stuff. Right? When you build a tech company, employees are number one raw material. Right? Yeah. Apart from cloud storage. Right? So if that's the case, then you want to attract really smart people, and the way to attract really smart people is talk about your ideas and see if there are smart people who agree with your idea. Or who are intrigued by the idea, and then they'll hopefully come and join your mission on doing it, right? So I'm not worried about it. I don't think it's a secret sauce, first of all, because every machine learning engineer I talk to, kind of good machine learning engineer I talk to, talks about these problem statements of how do you make a non-deterministic technology into deterministic. One of the ways of doing it is by using RAG plus decision trees. Another way of doing it is through fine tuning. Another way of doing it is to actually train an open source model with custom data, which is either synthetic or manual. So these are all kind of like documented methodologies. All we are doing is applying it to a particular problem that people like you and I have faced for the last 15 years, right? Yeah. And that's why it's such an exciting space. It's like you just gave me like a brand new weapon to solve all my old problems, and we should really think about what problems to solve now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and the fact that you are willing to share your ideas and how you're thinking about it, because I think that is what is required in our industry, and I don't think enough people are doing this kind of stuff where they're building in open, right? Like, I really believe in building out in open. I have so many ideas, I just don't know if I have the guts and the capacity to build it out in open. So I have to appreciate the fact that you are comfortable with it and you believe in that as well.
Yeah, on that note, I want to plug a friend of mine and an ex-colleague. He goes by the name Captain Nemo on Twitter, although I think he's not very active on it. So he does something really interesting on his GitHub page. I think he has a public repo called Ideas. I will link this from the show notes,
Okay.
right? Where he basically gives a bunch of what he thinks are ideas and bad ideas, and he basically says these are all the ideas he has, and then if anybody wants to collaborate, he'll either do a bounty or he'll work with them, and so on and so forth, right? I think it's a very, very cool way of doing stuff. That it includes everything from like Bangalore civic issues to like cool technology projects to everything, right? So everything, and he's a bit of a polyglot in the sense that he kind of thinks through problems in a very interesting manner. So he has everything from like how to make a Bangalore events list to Hacker News research bot. I'm just reading it off now. Telegram to RSS feed, right? Email on top of Keybase, API for workflowy, Facebook analytics. Like there's just so many things there, right? And then his whole point is I'm going to put all these ideas out there for free. If I'm working on something, then I'll also put the solution out there. But maybe there are people who really want to build something cool but don't have ideas, and they look at it and they vibe and they build stuff out, right? I'm a big believer in kind of talking about ideas. It's a little hard to build in the open in the security world just because there's so much smoke and mirrors and so much secrecy around it. For good reason, right? You don't want to talk about a lot of things. So for example, I can't talk about every company I'm working with right now simply because it kind of has implications for the companies we're working with, right? So in that way, we're in an industry which unfortunately has a little bit of secrecy, but startup founders like me have the ability to make those decisions because it's a small company, it's a small organization. So wherever I can, I'm very big on trying to share what we can, and what we cannot share about, we have to be responsible and keep it under wraps. Yeah.
Absolutely, man.
Anshuman, was there anything else you wanted to talk about today before I summarize what we spoke about?
I think I'm good. I think we covered quite a bit.
Yeah. So to summarize what we spoke about, we kind of spent a lot of time just discussing / arguing what threat modeling is, right? And if design reviews and threat modelings are the same thing, right? So that and we spoke about that, and essentially we realized that threat modeling as a concept is kind of universal and applies to a lot of things, but you're better off kind of defining something specific for your company and for your context. And design reviews are a subset of that threat modeling universe. We spoke about different methodologies, different toolings that you can use. We spoke about how manual versus automated is like a really long debate, and I think it's fair to say that both of us are pretty excited about how GenAI can solve some, if not all, of the threat modeling problems that we're going to have. Okay? All right. Thanks, Anshuman.
Thank you, Sandesh. See you next time.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.